sex with other women, physical abuse, and emotional trauma. This is what Sharon Tate was dealing with in her abusive marriage to Roman Polanski. In a previous video of mine, I touched on this subject of the abusive marriage she had, but after reading more of Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, it's really struck me how crazy of a marriage this was. For instance, according to Tom's book, on one occasion, Polanski smashed Sharon's face into a mirror. On another occasion, Polanski forced Sharon to watch a recording of him having sex with another woman. He cheated on Sharon many times throughout her pregnancy, most notably with Sharon's friend, Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. I am preparing a longer video on Sharon Tate's life, but reading this segment from Tom O'Neill's book just really struck me, and I want to share it with you here. After this, I'm going to share with you a few more things, but first, Tom O'Neill. Quote, having finished what would be her final film, The 13 Chairs, also known as 12+1, Sharon Tate came back to the Cielo house in July of 1969. She was more than 7 months pregnant. She wanted to have her baby in the house she loved, but Polanski, who was supposed to have returned by then as well, deferred his homecoming. He needed to continue scouting locations for his next film. Assuring Sharon that he'd be back in time for the baby's arrival, he asked his old friend Frykowski to stick around with Folger and keep Tate company. That, at least, is the version Bugliosi provides. Once I'd heard from him about Polanski's tape and the seedier side of Cielo Drive, I started to push harder in my interviews, and diverging stories developed. Polanski's close contacts said that Tate was grateful for the company. She didn't want to be alone in the secluded estate, especially at the end of her pregnancy. As for Polanski himself, his friends described him as careful, conservative, even square, and deeply in love with Sharon Tate. If he had to stay on in London for work, then that's what he was doing. Others remembered it differently. Tate had been horrified at the scene that greeted her upon returning to Los Angeles. She was leery of Folger and especially of Frykowski. She suspected he was drug dealing. Sharon wanted the couple and the crowd attached to them out of her house. As I won the confidence of some of Sharon's closest friends, they came out with intensely disturbing stories. Her marriage to Polanski was in shambles, they said, and many of them didn't want her to fix it. They wanted her to leave it. Polanski had established a pattern of abuse, emotional and physical. The Sharon Tate they knew, warm and vivacious, was diminished in his presence. The difference in Sharon was incredible, said Elke Sommer, the German actress who appeared with her in the film The Wrecking Crew. According to Elke Sommer, Sharon just wasn't herself when she was with him. She was in awe or frightened. That meant that Polanski could walk all over her. One friend, who called him one of the most evil people I ever met, said that he had smashed Tate's face into a mirror, and on another occasion, she forced her to watch a recording of him having sex with another woman. He cheated on her constantly and made sure that he knew about it. Another friend remembered an incident in which Polanski had asked his wife to wear the same dress that one of his other lovers had worn. When she appeared in her own dress instead, he threw her into the pool in front of their friends. Others said that Polanski hosted orgies at the house without his wife's knowledge or consent. Dominic Dune, who'd been close to Tate, Polanski, and Jay Sebring, was confident on that point. I never went to their orgies, but I knew they existed, and I think Jay was in on it too, he said to me. The director James Toback, who he himself would be disgraced nearly 20 years later by more than 200 allegations of sexual assault, was even more certain. One night, Warren Beatty had invited him to a party at Tate's house. Toback brought Jim Brown, a football all-star who'd become an action film hero. At the party, people began to whisper about an orgy. I was going to be included because I was with Jim, Toback told me, and I certainly was up for it, but Jim declined. And yet, Paul Silbert, a production designer and a friend of Polanski, told me, James Toback is full of shit, and always has been. Nothing crazy went on up there at the house. There were no orgies, not that I have ever been to, and I was up there frequently. With that said, Paul Silbert conceded that Polanski was quote-unquote peculiar, but whatever his kinkiness was, it was on a small scale and quite private. He might have been hinting at orgies, but there never were any. Again, that was from Paul Silbert. But orgies or no, at a certain point, Sharon Tate felt that she'd suffered enough. As the humiliations accumulated, she approached Elke Sommer for her advice. Sommer remembered telling her, I take the next heavy object, whether it's an iron or a frying pan or a spade out in the yard, and I just bash him. Sharon Tate wasn't about to do that, but she did, on a few occasions, warm to the idea of leaving Polanski. Elke Sommer believed that Sharon was always too much in her husband's thrall to follow through. As Sommer recalled, there was a tremendous sickness when I worked with Sharon. a horrendous sickness surrounding her relationship. She was quite lost. A number of Tate's friends were quick to mention the undesirable company she kept, with Frykowski and Folger at the top of the list. Tate couldn't stand them, said Joanna Patet, another actress who'd become close to her. Joanna and Sharon had lunch together at the house on the day of the murders. Joanna was surprised to see Frykowski and Folger, who she never met before, walking around like they owned the place. I asked, "Who are these people? Why are they here?" She said, "Roman didn't want me to be alone." According to Joanna, Tate only tolerated the pair because her husband insisted on it. On the phone with Polanski, so depressed that she fell into tears, she complained that Frykowski and Folger had brought too many drugs into the house, too much chaos. But Polanski refused to turn them out. She asked constantly when he would come home, but he kept postponing his return trip. Moreover, she tried to stay with him in London and he wouldn't let her. He didn't want her there. I'd gone to great lengths to track down Joanna, who'd quit the film industry in the 90s. She lived in the high desert beyond Palm Springs, where she was something of a recluse with no phone. It had dawned on me that I might be able to reach her through the Screen Actors Guild. They would have her address on file since they were responsible for mailing her residual checks. Through the Screen Actors Guild, I sent her a long letter, and she agreed to meet with me for lunch at a strip mall near her house. She was slightly apprehensive when she first arrived. "I lost it when Sharon was killed," she said. "I had to be hospitalized and missed the funeral." Joanna made no attempt to conceal her contempt for Polanski. "I hated him," she said flatly. As others had, Joanna described a marriage in which he exuded an almost casual cruelty toward his wife. For 4 months in the summer of '67, Joanna had stayed with the couple at a rented beach house, and she began to notice how often Polanski bossed Tate around. He had a malicious streak. Sometimes it reached Joanna herself. He would throw a brick in the pool and watch my dog dive for it and try to retrieve it. He stood there laughing. The dog wouldn't give up. After Sharon's funeral, Polanski called Joanna. On the phone, he was strange with me, cold as ice. There was no despair, and I was sobbing. Polanski wanted to know what Joanna had told the police. It made Joanna wonder, what was behind Sharon's murder? At the time, I suspected it was maybe friends of Polanski's who did it. All I know is he never came back to Los Angeles when she asked him to, but she was here. Figuring that Polanski's confidants would want to tell me a different story, I coaxed Bill Tennant, his manager, into talking to me. Tennant had never given an interview about the murders, in part because the events of '69 had sent his life into a tailspin. He'd had the somber task of identifying the bodies at the Tate house. A 1993 piece in Variety described Tennant's fall from grace. Through the 60s and 70s, he'd found great success in Hollywood, discovering the script for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and agenting Peter Fonda's deal for Easy Rider. But the author of this Variety piece, Peter Bart, described Tennant as a gaunt, battered figure sleeping in a doorway on Ventura Boulevard. A cocaine addiction had done away with his marriage and his money, leading him to trade even the gold inlays of his teeth for a fix. In Peter Bart's assessment, the shock of the Manson murders began unraveling him. I tracked down Tennant in London, where he was sober, remarried, and managing Michael Flatley, the Lord of the Dance. He'd become a born-again Christian, but he displayed little compassion or forgiveness for Polanski, his one-time client and friend. "Roman is a shit," he said. Echoing what I'd heard from other friends of the couple, Tennant said there were 2 versions of the story. He asked me, "Which one do you want to tell?" On one hand, Polanski had fallen into disillusion in London, where he was working on a movie and sleeping around, while back in California, his pregnant wife was putting together a home. Sharon wound up getting murdered because he was screwing around in London, Tennant said. But that was just one side of it. Tennant would add the following. The other story is sitting in the Bel Air Hotel with Roman after the funerals and having to address his financial situation, which was not good. Roman looked across the table at me and said, "I wish I had spent more. I wish I had bought more dresses. I wish I had given more gifts." So Tom, what story do you want to tell? The one about this little prick who left his wife alone? With Jay Sebring, Folger, and Wyotech, these wankers, these tragic losers? Or do you want to talk about a poor kid, Roman Polanski? That's what Tennant asked me. Tennant resisted the idea that the murders represented a loss of innocence for Hollywood. There was nothing innocent about it, he said. It was retribution. The big value in Los Angeles when he was there, Tennant said, was this. Who dies with the most toys wins. I think it's pretty self-serving to call that period and what was going on innocent. What's innocent about drugs? What's innocent about promiscuous sex? You tell me where the innocence was. Tennant would go on to add that within a week of the murders, Polanski was, quote-unquote, partying it up with Warren Beatty. The brutal reality was, in Tennant's words, that nobody cared or gave a shit about Sharon Tate. Not because they weren't nice, but because she was expendable. As expendable as an actor whose option comes up and gets dropped. After his wife's murder, Polanski stayed on the Paramount Studios lot as much as he could. It was the only place he felt safe. And not just from the killers or the media, but from the LAPD. You found the police surveillance units and you found that the police in Los Angeles knew everything about everybody, Tennant said. He would go on to add, there was a kind of FBI/CIA aspect of the Los Angeles Police Department, and they knew everything there was to know. Although he had no way of knowing it in 1969, Tennant wasn't being paranoid when he wondered how the LAPD knew so much about his friends. Many law enforcement agencies, including the LAPD, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and the FBI, had maintained units to surveil and even infiltrate groups they considered subversive or threatening. At this stage, I wasn't inclined to view law enforcement with anything approaching suspicion. Even so, I was beginning to see the official version of the Manson case with a jaundiced eye." End quote. Due to how abusive of a husband Polanski was, some people believe he may have had a hand in Sharon Tate's murder. Personally, I don't think he did. However, if it does turn out that he was involved in some capacity, it wouldn't be a complete shock. As I just quoted from Tom O'Neill's book, Polanski has a terrible reputation amongst several other people who knew him and Sharon personally. For some people, the fact Polanski was allegedly physically violent towards Sharon, that makes it even more plausible. Polanski could escalate that violence into murder. Whatever the case may be, Polanski did not exactly have a reputation of being a moral person. This is the same Roman Polanski who, after all, in 1977, admitted to the statutory rape of a 13-year-old girl. At the time, Polanski was 43. I'm making a video about pedophilia and Charles Manson, by the way. Once that video is ready, it will be linked here in the description box below. I also made a video going over some of the theories as to why Sharon Tate was murdered, including the theory that perhaps Polanski was involved to some extent. If you want to see that video, it's also linked here in the description box. I'm going to show you a clip from that video now. First, I'm going to tell you the mainstream narrative as to why these murders happened, and then I'm going to share with you what many people believe is the actual story. So, the mainstream narrative of the story is that Sharon Tate, along with the other victims, were not deliberately targeted, but rather they were collateral damage. The prevailing mainstream story as to why Manson targeted the house on Cielo Drive is because that's where record producer Terry Melcher was living. Charles Manson had a close relationship with Terry Melcher, and on various occasions, Manson and some of his followers actually spent time at the house on Cielo Drive. For his part, Terry Melcher had visited Spawn Ranch, the infamous hippie commune near Chatsworth, Los Angeles, where Manson and his followers were living. Terry was considering signing Manson to a record deal, but when the record deal never happened, Manson took his revenge by attacking Melcher's house. Therefore, according to this version of the story, it was irrelevant who was actually killed in Terry Melcher's home on Cielo Drive, because the point wasn't about targeting any one specific person, but rather killing anyone who happened to be in the house as a message to Terry. According to the mainstream narrative, Manson didn't even know Terry Melcher didn't live at the house anymore. During the Manson hearings the following year in 1970, Terry Melcher stated that after the murders, he had never met with Manson ever again. Now, as the years have gone by, more and more people have begun to challenge the mainstream story regarding the Manson murders. First and foremost, Manson was aware that Terry Melcher didn't live at that house on Cielo Drive anymore. The idea that Manson didn't know he wasn't there isn't true. Terry also said he never met Manson again after the murders. However, journalist Tom O'Neill was able to prove that Terry Melcher did in fact meet with Charles Manson not just once, but multiple times after the killings. Tom O'Neill's findings proved that Melcher did lie about this in court. As a matter of fact, Tom O'Neill has stated that he did approach Terry Melcher regarding his findings. According to Tom, Terry Melcher was livid that he was going to publish this information. Bottom line, given how much of the Manson story has been proven to be false, could it be that the Mansons did specifically target Sharon Tate? According to Tom and various others, the Manson family did actually plan to kill Sharon Tate and her friends at least on one other occasion. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wyotech Frykowski were 4 of the victims killed on August 9, 1969 by the Manson family. Infamously, when the Manson family invaded the Sharon Tate house on August 9th, the first thing Manson follower Tex Watson did was cut the phone lines. Now, with that kept in mind, something eerily similar happened on another occasion. According to Tom O'Neill and various others, Sharon, Jay, Abigail, and Wyotech were hanging out at another house not long before August 9th. As the 4 friends were hanging out, the lights in that house started to act weird. It was later discovered that someone had cut power lines connected to that house. None of this is a conspiracy, by the way. This pre-August 9th incident 100% happened. But the question is, why and who? Who cut the power lines? The prevailing theory here is that the Manson family did intend on killing Sharon, Jay, Abigail, and Wyotech on this occasion, but they cut the wrong lines and bailed. That part hasn't been proven, but it's certainly a pretty big coincidence that something like this would happen to Sharon and her friends briefly before they were murdered in a disturbingly similar circumstance. The deeper you dig into the Manson story, the more you come across these weird coincidences. Tom O'Neill and others argue that this pre-August 9th incident does strongly suggest the Manson family was targeting Sharon Tate and her friends specifically. I personally agree with that. I do think Sharon Tate and her circle of friends were specifically targeted. But again, the question is why? There are many theories as to what the motive may have been to kill Sharon Tate, but up to this point, at least not publicly, there is no definitive answer as to why Sharon and her friends were specifically targeted. Some people believe Sharon Tate's husband, Roman Polanski, may have had a hand in this. Personally, I don't think he had anything to do with Sharon's murder, but to be clear, Polanski was a very abusive husband to Sharon Tate, and that's why some people think he may have been involved in the murder in some capacity. Regarding Polanski's abusive behavior, for instance, it's well documented that when Sharon Tate told Polanski she was pregnant, Polanski demanded she get an abortion. When Sharon didn't agree to have an abortion, Roman had a very public affair with Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Michelle was a friend of Sharon's. Then, after the murders, police in Los Angeles found video of Polanski forcing Sharon Tate into having threesomes. As a matter of fact, Roman Polanski was known to show sex tapes of Sharon to his house guests. Polanski has a very disturbing sexual history. Most notably, of course, in 1977, Roman Polanski raped a 13-year-old girl in the U.S. That's why he permanently fled the United States for France in order to avoid the legal consequences. Bottom line, Polanski was both emotionally and sexually abusive towards Sharon Tate. According to the film, Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth, Sharon Tate was actually planning on divorcing Polanski. This film was made by Jay Sebring's nephew, Anthony DiMaria. In the film, an attorney says that he met with Sharon Tate regarding getting a divorce between her and Polanski. This same attorney felt certain that Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were still in love, which quite frankly would make sense. Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate stayed very close even after they broke up. It wouldn't have been hard to imagine they were still in love. Now, this divorce rumor has never been confirmed, but I do think it's likely true. Sharon wanted a traditional monogamous relationship, a marriage with Roman Polanski in the old-fashioned way. But Polanski still wanted to live a swinger lifestyle. On the 50th anniversary of Sharon Tate's death, August 9, 2019, The Washington Post wrote an article about Sharon. In that article, The Washington Post reported that apparently, if Polanski didn't change his behavior in the first 2 weeks after the baby was born, Sharon Tate intended to divorce him. I want to emphasize that this was reported by a major news outlet, The Washington Post. Now, obviously, major news outlets get things wrong all the time. However, I still think it's noteworthy that The Washington Post would publish an article in which they state Sharon Tate was strongly considering a divorce. The reason this is noteworthy to me is because in the mainstream narrative of Sharon Tate's life, there's no mention whatsoever that she was strongly considering divorcing Polanski. Again, these are the reasons some people think Polanski may have had a hand in the murders. As I said before, I personally don't think he was involved, but when reporting on a story, if you're trying to be honest in your reporting, it's important to showcase why people feel the way they do about certain things. Polanski's very abusive behavior towards Sharon Tate does condemn him in the eyes of many people who think he had a hand in the tragedy. Now, regarding the movie Jay Sebring's nephew made, I came across this following review. Quote, "In the film that Jay Sebring's nephew made about his uncle, an attorney stated that Sharon had him file divorce papers to end her marriage to Polanski. Unfortunately, Sharon was murdered before Polanski could be served with the documents. Polanski wanted Sharon to go to Brazil to have an abortion. She refused. At this point, Polanski verbally abused her, even in front of her friends. Then, he cheated on her. After the murders, the LAPD found a video in the Cielo Drive house of Polanski, forcing Sharon into threesomes. While Jay Sebring was trying to save Sharon's life, Polanski was in London having yet another affair. Sharon, at least in the beginning, tolerated Polanski's infidelity. She loved him so much that she looked the other way. In the last months of Sharon's life, however, it bothered her immensely that he was being unfaithful to her. Of course, years after Sharon's death, Polanski infamously raped a 13-year-old girl in 1977. He fled to France to escape a prison sentence in the United States. About 15 years later, he raped a woman in France. Polanski has made it known that he likes young girls, and it's believed that he sexually assaulted other women in France as well." End quote. Now, going back specifically to the Manson murders, as mentioned, I do believe, based on the information uncovered by Tom O'Neill, that Sharon Tate and her friends were specifically targeted. But again, the question is why? If only Tex Watson, Manson's main assassin, was on record clarifying what had actually happened. Well, actually, he might be. Tom O'Neill discovered that there's about 20 hours of audio tape of Tex Watson discussing everything. However, due to multiple legal complications, those tapes have been kept locked away despite multiple efforts to get them released. Hopefully one day those tapes do surface and we get some more clarity as to why these murders happened. One hypothetical question that gets thrown around from time to time is, what if Sharon Tate was never killed? What if the Manson murders never happened? Well, spoiler alert, director Quentin Tarantino touched on this subject in his film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. At the end of that film, the would-be Manson murderers were the ones who got killed. Sharon Tate and her friends all survived, and that's where the film ends. As of this posting on August 9th, 2025, which is the 56th anniversary of the Sharon Tate murders, director David Fincher is in the process of making a sequel to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. This sequel will focus on Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character from the first film. David Fincher has directed Brad Pitt in 3 other major movies: Seven, Fight Club, and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. There are rumors that in this follow-up to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Margot Robbie may return in some capacity as Sharon Tate. Again, at this point, these are just rumors, but it would certainly be interesting to see how they would portray Sharon Tate in a timeline based after the Manson murders. If Sharon Tate had lived, would she have become a massive star? Would she have divorced Polanski and married Jay Sebring? There are so many what-ifs about this situation. And in the bigger picture of things, how would society be different if the Manson murders never happened? The murders sent shockwaves through society, and for many people, these killings destroyed the romantic image of the hippie movement. Hippies were supposed to be about peace and love, not murder. Well, according to a lot of people, that was actually the point. Many people believe that Manson was some sort of a CIA MKUltra asset, and that the plan was for him to orchestrate a series of horrific murders in order to turn public opinion against the hippie movement. Why? Because the hippies were against the war in Vietnam and many other key issues to the government. I'll be doing a deeper dive into that subject in another video. For now, however, I do want to touch on something I discussed in a previous video, which I found very interesting, especially since it's not a very well-known story. Apparently, Sharon Tate had a vision of her body mutilated years before the murder actually happened. Did Sharon have some sort of a premonition about the Manson murders? I'm going to share with you that story in a few minutes, but first, here's a quick clip of Charles Manson himself deflecting any responsibility for the Sharon Tate murder.
After you knew what that had happened at Sharon Tate, the most brutal murder that people were aware of. Not that there's not a lot of other brutality around, but this got attention. What'd you think?
Well, I looked over in Vietnam. I saw
No. What'd you think about Sharon Tate and her unborn baby?
What did I think about it?
And yeah,
It's not my world. I don't live in that world.
well, so you didn't care?
Care?
Suppose
What the
technically...
hell does that mean, care?
Well, it means love. That means some
Put
sense
me
of...
in a solitary confinement, break my teeth out, break my ribs, brush me up, kick me down a hole,
Right.
and then come back and tell me about care. I don't know what care is, man.
Never once did Charles Manson ever express any remorse or regret for orchestrating the murder of Sharon Tate. As a matter of fact, he never expressed any remorse for any of the murders. It's very unfortunate that there are still some people out there who admire Charles Manson, but that's not going to be the topic of this video. I want to share with you that story of Sharon Tate's vision. According to CieloDrive.com, on September 2nd, 1969, columnist Dick Kleiner wrote a very interesting piece about how apparently Sharon Tate told him in 1966, 3 years before her death, that she saw a vision of her body mutilated. Quote, "It was just a creepy story when Sharon Tate told it to me in early 1966. But now, 3 years and several murders later, it has acquired something much more than just creepiness. Sharon was a starlet in 1966. People thought she was going to be a big star, and maybe she would have been. She was sensational to look at, but there was something a little strange about her. Everybody noticed it. People thought at the time perhaps it was because her first feature film was an oddball terror thing called Eye of the Devil. But in any case, you could look at her for hours and listen to the nutty stories coming out of that beautiful head. I like stories of the supernatural, and Sharon knew that. She had a story like that to share with me. The story involved Jay Sebring and his house in Benedict Canyon. No, not the house where Sharon and Jay were killed in 1969. That house was on Cielo Drive, just off Benedict. But those two houses can't be much more than a mile apart. Anyways, Sharon used to date Jay Sebring. This was before she met Roman Polanski. Sharon and Jay were together for years, and Jay had a house in Benedict Canyon. This house was once owned by Paul Byrne, a director, writer, and producer for MGM. On September 5th, 1932, Paul Byrne commits suicide in this house. Sharon calmly told me this story. Now, at some point in Sharon's relationship with Jay Sebring, it seems that Jay was in New York on business, and Sharon was in between apartments. She called Jay and asked if she could stay in his house. Of course she could. That night at the house, that dark night, she was alone. Sharon wasn't usually spooked, but for some reason that night in the house, she was. She kept a light on by the side of her bed. Sharon told me, "I saw a creepy little man. He looked like the pictures I'd seen of Paul Byrne." Sharon ran downstairs. When she got downstairs, she wished she was still upstairs. "I saw a vision of someone tied to the staircase," she said. "It might have been me. It might have been Jay, but whoever it was, this body was cut open at the throat." Sharon needed a drink to calm her nerves. She eventually found the house bar, and there was some wallpaper by that bar. For some reason, Sharon picked away at the wallpaper and tore it down. Strange how the mind works. Worrying about wallpaper when ghosts are wandering around upstairs and mutilated bodies are tied to the staircase downstairs. Sharon thought it must have been a dream. She decided to find out and went back upstairs. According to Sharon, the mutilated body was still tied to the stairs. Could it have been her body or Jay's body? And that creepy little man was still prowling around upstairs. But Sharon went back to bed and somehow slept. When Jay Sebring came back the next morning, he woke her up. She remembered the events of the night before, but it must have been a dream. However, according to Sharon, Jay called out, "Hey, who tore the wallpaper off by the bar down here?" That part, at least, was not a dream. 3 years later, a mile up the road, there was a nightmare. Sharon, Jay, and 3 others, 4 if you include Sharon's unborn child, were all killed.